what it was a recording, possibly of Kurt Schwitter himself, performing the Ur-Sonate of 1932. And what that is a piece of sound poetry. It's fun to perform. You can see that it is a written text, but it's a written text not in any known language. Fums bo taza upogif qui e order bibe fums bo bibo fums bo wo bibo fums bo wo ta bo fums bo wo taza fums bo wo taza u. As you can see, although it's not actually written in any known language, in a sense it can't escape mimicking language. There's repetition of words, there's use of vowels, consonants, etc., etc. And it's like an extreme instance of treating language as sound on the level of the signifier, but ignoring the level of the signified or content. And that is one of the key techniques or dimensions of the postmodern that I'll be talking about today, in particular relation to Joyce. I mean, I just hope to play you that before the formal lecture began, but unfortunately the technology couldn't cope with it, so I apologize for that. Now, we mentioned earlier that one of the influences on Joyce in and around his notion of realism was the French novelist Gustave Flaubert, most famous for Madame Bovary and L'éducation sentimentale, sentimental education. We can see, extremely visible traces of that influence in Stephen's description of his artistic credo in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where in describing the kind of art that interested Stephen and behind him Joyce, Stephen describes the artist in the following terms. The artist, like the God of creation, remains within or behind or beyond or outside his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. And that kind of description is the one that is behind the kind of realism that Joyce was writing in Dubliners. The artist isn't making his own opinions felt directly. The moral of the stories in Dubliners are never given. They're often mysterious. All the work has to be done by the reader from the text created by the artist. And what's particularly striking here is the fact that Stephen's by now very famous definition of the qualities of the artist, like the God of creation, is actually drawn very directly and translated from a letter that Flaubert wrote to one of his friends on 18th of March, 1857, where he's talking about Madame Bovary, the novel. And he writes, Madame Bovary n'a rien de vrai. There's absolutely nothing true in Madame Bovary. C'est une histoire totalement inventée. It's a totally invented story. Je n'y ai rien mis ni de mes sentiments, ni de mon existence. There's nothing in it of my own feelings or sentiments or of my being. On the contrary, the illusion, if there is one, stems from the impersonality of the work. That is one of my principles. You must not write yourself. The artist in his work, and here we have the sentence that Joyce repeated almost word for word, the artist in his work must be like God in creation, invisible and all-powerful. You can sense him everywhere, but you cannot see him. And that is a dimension of the realist mode for both Flaubert and Joyce. It's impersonality, it's giving a representation of the real which seems like the real itself to be God-given, to be unopinioned in some sense. But I want to take that a little bit further and say that this position of the artist, which Joyce draws from Flaubert, has another dimension to it, which we can approach more historically. And that is under the rubric of the social position of the artist. And it's something that the great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu describes really well in his own writings on Flaubert, as well as on, many other people. And Bourdieu, in one of his late essays from 2003 on the attack on culture, I think it's called, he notes how it took painters nearly 500 years to achieve the social conditions that made a Picasso possible. But now all of that is under threat from the reduction of works of art to products and commodities. And what he puts his finger on here is something that's been bubbling around in questions that people have put during the course, which is kind of, how was someone like Joyce possible? How was that incredible act of authorship possible? And you'll see why I referred a moment ago back to Flaubert. It's because Joyce fully occupied the arts for art's sake position that Flaubert advocated and that was taken up by a number of writers, and that art for art's sake dimension meant a breaking away from the canons of popular and bourgeois taste, as we've discussed before, and also with that a withdrawal from seeking to make the artistic commodity particularly profitable. And here you have with Ulysses a prime example, in the sense that the first edition was only of 1,000 copies. It was in essence a piece of private publication. And this remained as he went on to work with Finnegan's Wake. Essentially, the books were produced not for really large publishing concerns, but for avant-garde coterie audiences. And it's the narrowness of those audiences which explained in part the ways in which Joyce could be so inventive. He wasn't beholden to the received ideas of what a novel should be, of what writing should be, which alone would have ensured publication in a wider format. Bourdieu writes about this in the following terms. He reminds us that the invention of the writer and the artist, to which Flaubert himself contributed so much, is the end result of a collective enterprise which is inseparable from, number one, the constitution of an autonomous literary field, independent of or even opposite to the economic field. And that's held in the opposition between the terms like the bohemian versus the bourgeois, a very what became a very modernist characteristic. And second, the constitution of a tactical position within the artistic field itself of the artist versus the bohemian. And he notes something particularly appropriate to Joyce, that the literary and artistic field attract a particularly strong proportion of individuals who possess all the properties of the dominant class except one: money. They lack money. And if you read through Joyce's correspondence, as I've been doing in the past few days, you'll see that many of the letters are kind of begging letters, as Joyce sought to get a little bit of money to keep going under quite desperate financial circumstances. Pursuing arts for art's sake doesn't yield immediate economic benefit, and in fact the artist defines himself against that seeking for immediate economic benefit. What it does in creating this autonomous art market is, when it's successful, as Joyce ultimately was, is deferring the economic returns on artistic production. There's what Bourdieu calls a time lag, as he puts it here in an essay, a collection of essays called Flaubert and the French Literary Field. The symbolic revolution through which artists free themselves from bourgeois demands, and what I'm saying really is that this is particularly characteristic or definitive of modernism, symbolic revolutions in which artists free themselves from bourgeois demands and define themselves as the sole masters of their art while refusing to recognize any other master other than their art, has the effect of eliminating the market. So Joyce's motto, non serviam, I will not serve, or I do not serve, is emblematic of that. And as Bourdieu notes very correctly, as the autonomy of cultural production increases, so does the time lag that is necessary for works to impose the norms of perception they bring along. This time lag between supply and demand tends to become a structural characteristic. The partisans of art for art's sake are destined to deferred economic gratification, or even none at all, or posthumous. And there you have it. Just note that phrase, imposing the norms of perception they bring along. It's a moot point how much the norms of perception that Joyce brought into action in Ulysses have become accepted. Quite a few of them have, like the most popular is the stream of consciousness narration. Others couldn't really catch on. So what you have, and I've been thinking about this again in response to the discussions we've had, of can you really think of Ulysses? How can you think of it in a way that helps you to get hold of it? And one thing that occurred to me today as I was thinking about it was a particular kind of image, which I'll just put to you right now, which is, again, around the question which people have been asking of, is Ulysses a book? Is it a novel? What is it exactly? And one thing that the image that comes to mind when I think of that is that in all the different editions of Ulysses that I have, and I sort of make a hobby of collecting them, the novel is in pages which are confined between the covers of the book, and the pages are two-dimensional. You know, each page in itself is two-dimensional. But to get hold of Ulysses, you have, in a sense, to visualize it as a three-dimensional text, a text woven from many different threads, which kind of connect and grow richer and richer, so that you have, in a sense, like a huge knitted kind of 3D object full of connections with different colors of thread, different knots connecting one thing to another, but like a massive kind of actual object. And it's the way in which Ulysses becomes this kind of particular artistic object, which makes it very, very unique, almost unique in a sense, although perhaps all novels try and do something like that, try to become art objects. But this is both the source of the pleasure and the difficulty of Ulysses, is that above all, it is a work of art. And a work of art that, in the ways that Bourdieu, Flaubert and Joyce are well aware of, one that challenges the usual conceptions of what a book, a novel writing are, how they're entertaining, how they enter the market, and so on and so forth. So that's really what occurred to me this morning in thinking back over our talks and the comments you've made. But to continue and focus more on the ways in which that challenge to the marketplace of literature might be come to a head in the idea of a certain, what I'm calling here, postmodernism. Let me try and get through to that by reminding you once again of one of the key things I've tried to put to you, that all these terms are better understood relationally rather than substantially, rather than one by one. Realism, we saw, attempts to mirror reality, to offer an accurate, objective, photographic and three-dimensional, though in writing, representation of the world. Modernism shares something with that, but grows out of it in a way I've tried to describe by drawing attention rather to the framing of the mirror or the framing of reality, underlining above all the subjectivity of the depictor or the narrator. And this is what you find in James's famous emphasis on point of view. His tales are told, especially The Turn of the Screw, but many others, from the point of view of a narrator that you don't know if you can trust them. So however realistic their description may seem, you're led to not quite believe it, not to trust it. And that kind of distrust is magnified and amplified in the untrustworthy narrators of a Joseph Conrad or an E.M. Forster, particularly in the his classic novels. And this comes through to stream of consciousness as a particular technique in Joyce, also in William Faulkner and in Virginia Woolf herself. Now, where modernism begins to break from that, to amplify it, but to break with it, to differentiate itself from that, is postmodernism really emphasizes the breaking of the frame itself, not just drawing attention to the frame and what subjectivity is constituted by and constituted in that frame, but pointing to the incoherence and contradictoriness of the subject itself. And doing this by, in particular, drawing attention to the materials which allow for representation in painting, in cinema, and in literature. Your eyes are drawn to the paint, to the canvas, to the cut, to, well, what we'll see in Joyce's writing. And it's important to attend to these, what I'm calling here, postmodernist elements, the most radical elements of Ulysses, as what you can see as the novel goes on from episode to episodes. And Joyce, is caught up in a creative frenzy and wants to outdo himself from one episode to another, is that as he goes on, really, he really begins to criticize and to get more and more distant from the norms of realism, the norms of the novel, the rules of the game. And that's why, even after 100 years, the novel is so challenging, because we still tend to have the same kind of received ideas of how a novel works, what it is, and so on and so forth. And Joyce, 100 years ago, kind of went beyond those things, and it's still challenging to see him doing that, I think. So in the postmodern, you have an extreme defamiliarizing of language in poetry and the novel in particular, an extreme defamiliarizing, making unfamiliar of language. Socially and politically, as we discussed a little bit at the beginning, this may reflect the changing experience of life in cities, big cities, metropolises, particularly as there are waves of migration and change after the First World War and after revolution. Raymond Williams, one of my favorite critics, put this very well in a late essay of his, where he notes that one of the effects of the new cities of the early 20th century was that language was more evident as a medium. And once it becomes evident as a medium rather than as something natural, it becomes a medium that can be shaped and reshaped. It's no longer just an invisible social custom that you take for granted. It becomes something you can be alienated from because you can see that it's not just a natural thing. And that relates in part to hearing other languages spoken in cities and so on. This great defamiliarization is aided and abetted by two kind of radically new currents in intellectual life, which take place alongside Joyce's own formation. The first is in the theory of language itself, and this is canonized in what was published in 1916 as the Course in General Linguistics, a book which has had an extraordinary influence not only on linguistics but on cultural analysis and semiology in the 100 years or so since its publication, in the work of Barthes, Eco, and many, many others. The book was made up of notes taken in lectures that Saussure gave in Geneva between 1907 and 1911, around about the time of Joyce's major period of composition. And a central feature of this is this getting into focus in a new way, something about how language worked, something about the linguistic sign. And this is very straightforward in a sense. It's Saussure's insistence that the linguistic sign has two sides or two dimensions to it. First of all, there's the acoustic image of the sign, the sound of a word, which he calls le signifiant, the signifier. And the second, which in a sense more attention has often been paid to in previous philosophy and so on, is the concept or mental image associated with the signifier, le signifié, the signified, what is meant by the particular sound as it becomes embodied in a word. So every word has two sides. On the one hand, it's a sound, the sound emphasized, that's why I began with the Kurt Schwitter's poem. It's just sound, but it's also, what's really fascinating is how mental images, meanings, concepts become attached to that sound, so that the two things seem bonded quite naturally, but in reality, once you can see that they're bonded, the bond can become kind of attenuated or weaker, as you'll see what happens. Similarly, as language became an object of analysis in a new way in linguistics. Language was also thought about in a completely new way under the tremendous influence on culture of Sigmund Freud, from the studies on hysteria through the interpretation of dreams to the great cultural texts of from 1916 to 1930. Freud revolutionized the ways in which people began thinking about many things, and amongst these, above all, the idea of language. Prior to Freud, in a sense, language was seen as an instrument completely under the control of an individual. After Freud, what began to interest artists such as the Surrealists, but also Joyce, is the way in which language, rather like the two sides of Saussure, language always had conscious elements and unconscious elements at work. In the stream of consciousness in particular, Joyce uses the unconscious associations at work in Stephen, Bloom and Molly to give a very rich portrait of their interior lives. Young and easily Freudened, as Joyce puts it in Finnegan's Wake, shows up this deep interest in the dynamics of language in and around psychoanalysis and the unconscious. So in the period, there's like a tremendous revolution in ideas of language and what these can do to forms of aesthetic production in the novel, in poetry, in the new cinema, in painting as well. One of the central devices here is known as defamiliarization, a term created by Russian thinker Viktor Shklovsky in his great 1917, note the date, Art as Technique. And he kind of rails against the habitual in a way that has been anticipated by Flaubert's distrust of received ideas, which Joyce shared with Flaubert, also in this different way with Shklovsky. Habitualization, wrote Shklovsky, devours works, clothes, furniture, one's wife, and the fear of war. Habituation does that because you don't notice them anymore. Art exists to combat habitualization. It exists so that one can recover the sensations of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not just as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Well, when he writes that, he could so well be describing Ulysses, which of course hasn't been published at that point, but it really captures, or it's one way of understanding why the book challenges you. It's to prolong the time you spend with the book in order to make things unfamiliar so that you begin to see things in a radically different way. Defamiliarization became a key mode of artistic production in modernism. You can see it in surrealism, in cubism, in many different things. Another fascinating, and quite widespread modernist technique is that of montage. And if you're interested, I've just written an essay on montage in cinema, which I could put out to you if anybody's interested, where you get more background to what I'm saying here, if you're interested. Montage is most associated with the works of the great Russian director, Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein. And he, again, he's looking like Joyce, like the other modernists, to somehow get beyond realism into something else, something that promotes greater interpretation, stronger interpretation, and so on. He writes in an unpublished book, or notes towards a book he was never able to finish, the Montage 1938 essay, that it's precisely the montage principle, as distinct from the depictive principle, which forces the spectator himself to create, and hereby releases that great force of latent creative excitement within the spectator, which distinguishes an emotional work from the informational logic of a plain exposition of events. And in that sort of formulation, you see, in a kind of parallel way to what we saw with Henry James and Virginia Woolf, how there's a move away from the logic of a plain exposition of events to something that engages the reader or the spectator more deeply, more subjectively, creates emotions and so on, and releases a great force of latent creative excitement. Again, nothing better describes really what Ulysses is trying to do than to write in ways which engage the reader and get the reader to generate this sort of excitement from within themselves. And that process is described in, a kind of throwaway comment in a review of Ibsen's work that Joyce wrote in 1900, where, without knowing the name of the montage principle, because Eisenstein hadn't put it into circulation as yet, nonetheless Joyce describes the workings of this montage principle. And he's writing about Ibsen's play When We Dead Awaken. When we see Professor Rubeck first, he is sitting in a garden chair reading his morning paper, but by degrees the whole scroll of his life is unrolled before us, and we have the pleasure not of hearing it read out to us, but of reading it for ourselves, piecing the various parts together and going closer to see where the writing on the parchment is fainter or less legible. Here, Joyce, in writing of Ibsen, says that a good dramatist is one that makes the audience think about what's happening and put things together for themselves and create some excitement rather than just be told things. And it's a principle which he finds in Ibsen, which he's going to take to extremes in his own writings. Montage, just to make more precise, in cinema is understood as the placing of one image next to another image in order to create in the minds of the spectator a third meaning, something which Hitchcock, who I'll be talking about next week, was particularly keen on, the ways in which film could get the brain of the spectator working and create more meaning than what was given. From the fragments create a new unity. Montage is a dominant stylistic feature in Ulysses, and it's something which in some ways is quite challenging, as it's one of the ways in which the novel works to try and make the reader think differently about what he's reading. There's a lot of montage in Ulysses. I'd say it's a structuring principle, or in many ways, in the novel. On the global level, we have what we've talked about before, simply the montage operation which Joyce forces us to engage with by calling the novel Ulysses and making each episode of the novel refer back to an episode from Homer's Odyssey. There's a structuring principle of montage here, as we're asked to compare and contrast and create our interpretation through that comparison of what's happening in Ulysses and what's happening in the Odyssey. Just to run through how that works, in the first episode we looked at Telemachus, where Stephen is Telemachus, Mulligan and Haynes are the kind of evil suitors who's taken over much of Stephen's life, in a sense, taken control of some of his money, taken control of the tower where they live, and so on. You can see the comparison surfacing as Stephen says things which are very appropriate to Telemachus in his plight, living with the suitors of his mother in the absence of his father. How long is Haynes going to stay in the tower? He asks early on in the novel. And Haynes is the British student who's come over to Ireland to investigate it for some academic work. But here the parallel is with one of the suitors who are occupying Penelope's home, occupying Ithaca, in other words. How long are the suitors going to stay? That's one of the parallel montage things between Stephen and Telemachus. Similarly, when Mulligan says, "Daedalus, come down like a good mosey." My own interpretation of mosey, which is from the verb to mosey, to walk slowly or saunter and so on and so forth, is that it's a way of saying a servant, an ironic way of saying a servant. So just as Telemachus in the Iliad is treated disrespectfully as a kind of servant in Ithaca, so is Daedalus in Ulysses. And that makes Daedalus, Stephen, think, why should I bring it down? And he's referring to the nickel shaving bowl, which the episode starts off with. I am another now, and yet the same, a servant too, a servant, a server of a servant. And it's as if Telemachus is thinking. And then about money, Mulligan gets money from Stephen. Seriously, Daedalus, I'm stony broke. Hurry out to get your school kip and bring us back some money. Stephen thinks he wants the key. It is mine. I paid the rent, but Mulligan is insisted on having it. I won't sleep there tonight. Home also I cannot go. And the final word of the episode is usurper, a very Homeric word in referring to Telemachus's perceptions of the suitors around him who are usurping the place of his father. So, and there's obviously more instances of that in the novel. And indeed, throughout the novel, there's a continuous parallel montage that Joyce has put in. The parallel montage is given, as a technique, is given particular prominence in episode 10, The Wandering Rocks, which is also, I'm mentioning it because it's a confusing episode to read, in part because it is itself divided into 19 different sections, which are really operating around the principle of montage, in which the same moment in time, although that same moment is 1 hour from 3 to 4 in the afternoon, is given to us from different viewpoints, which at times coincide. The different viewpoints, there are many different, there are 19 different ones: John Comey, Corny Keller, One-Legged Sailor, Blazes Boylan, etc., etc. And it's a very cinematic technique, a bit like, if you remember, the opening of Strangers on a Train, where you watch two sets of footsteps walking, one from left to right across the screen, one walking from right to left across the screen. You don't see who they belong to. One's very fancy shoes, one's very plain shoes, and you wonder, where are they going to meet, what's going to happen. And that's the same dynamic as in the Wandering Rocks, perhaps in some ways the most cinematic sequence of Ulysses. Another major modernist technique which we have, or postmodernist technique which we have in Ulysses, is one that again draws attention to the unnaturalness of language, the conventionality of language which Saussure was so insistent on claiming. And that comes through in the famous episode 14, Oxen of the Sun. Again, it's an episode which, if you read it with the expectation that this is a chapter in a Robert Ludlum novel or a Lee Child novel, I mean, I'm not disparaging these as like my favorite, some of my favorite writers, but just in a different gear. You're not going to enjoy it. You have to find out the ways of enjoying it by understanding what Joyce is doing, which he does give you clues about within the text itself, so that if you read through the text, you'll see that one thing that very visibly happens is that the chapter parodies or imitates hundreds of years of different styles of writing in English, working from very brutal translations or parodies of the way Latin historians such as Sallust and Tacitus write, moving through things like Anglo-Saxon alliteration, before babe born, bliss had, within womb one he worship, ending up really with a babel of what Joyce described as a frightful jumble of pidgin English, Cockney Irish, slang and broken doggerel. So it's not surprising that episode is difficult to read, because it's breaking all the rules of narration, where narration is supposed to make language invisible so that you enjoy the plot. Instead, the language is foregrounded, defamiliarizing your idea of how a plot moves forward, and so on and so forth, and giving you a sort of shock. Similarly, I asked you to have a look at episode 16, Eumaeus, which is another sort of weird and challenging chapter. And it's worth pointing out that this was the chapter that Joyce enjoyed the most in some ways, the ones that made him laugh the most. I mean, he really had a good time writing it, whereas Oxen of the Sun took, I think, 10,000 hours for him to write. I'm not sure how long this chapter did, but he really enjoyed it, because what it was another kind of return to Flaubert, and a kind of operationalizing of Flaubert's famous dictionary of received ideas, as what Joyce was trying to do was just, instead of trying to write in a way that was beautiful and unique and artistic, to write in a deliberately boring, hackneyed, pedestrian way, with lots of repetition and things which an editor should cross out because he's repeating the same idea. And of course, it's meant in some ways to signify the exhaustion of Stephen and Bloom at late in the middle of the night, after they've been out drinking and so on, and they're just really tired. So it's just like the language itself is tired, and it slips into monotonous, repetitious, hackneyed, pedestrian language, as in this example. This was a quandary, but bringing common sense to bear on it, evidently there was nothing for it but put a good face on the matter and foot it, which they accordingly did. So there's lots of redundance there. If you're bringing common sense to bear, you don't really have to say evidently. Putting a good face on the matter is such a cliche. Bringing common sense to bear is another cliche, and so on and so on. So beveling around by Mullets and the Signal House, which they shortly reached, Well, of course they shortly reached it, because you've just told us that they're bevelling around it. So they proceeded perforce in the direction of Amiens Street railway terminus, Mr. Bloom being handicapped by the circumstance that one of the back buttons of his trousers had to vary the time-honoured adage, gone the way of all buttons. And, you know, the repetition and the boringness and the stuff of saying to vary the time-honoured adage, gone the way of all buttons. It's meant to make you laugh because it's so outrageously, ridiculously boring and repetitious. As I say, if you read it in that sort of frame, you'll really enjoy it because it's very funny. But it's breaking the frame of the usual expectations in ways characteristic of that foregrounding of convention, which is essential to understanding much postmodernism. And then we come to another major element of this, the postmodern elements of expression in Ulysses, which is the way that language begins to disintegrate from the unity of signifier and signified, which Saussure had emphasized, and for the signifier to take on almost a life of its own. Of course, in the book as a whole, Joyce is extremely attentive to the sound of words, writing in prose as poets, and Joyce was also a minor poet, as poets are supposed to do, being very attentive to the sound of words and all the plays of alliteration and assonance and onomatopoeia and all those poetic devices which poets use. For example, in Proteus, you are walking on the beach, to return to that episode very straightforwardly. Stephen closed his eyes to hear his boots crush crackling wrack and seashells. You have the alliteration of crush, crackling, the onomatopoeia of crush, crackling, the assonance of crackling and rack, and then you finally have the crush, crack, crick, crick, the ways in which those words are imitating almost the sounds of his boots crushing the seashells. Crush, crack, crick, crick. And there, where crush and crack have signifieds, they have usual meanings, it's really their signifier quality which is emphasized here, just how those words sound rather than any meaning given to them. Crick, crick doesn't really have a meaning. At that point, the letters are forming a signifier but not a signified. Similarly, in that attention to the universe of sound, which maybe was a part of Joyce's, you know, fading eyesight and difficulty with seeing and disturbed vision. Just see how he transcribes the cat's meow, as I think we usually put it when we translate that into language, how he seems to capture better its sonic qualities in the fourth episode of the book. Meow, meow. And it's purring from purr, purr to grrr as it gets the milk. And then also just note the omnipresence of song and singing throughout the text. How many songs are referenced there? Poems which also can be sung. It's no surprise that Joyce was an amateur musician and vocalist himself. The book is one of the most musical in terms of its referential range of popular songs, of operas, of ecclesiastical music and chants of any text. So the book, Ulysses, again, it just kind of escapes the flatness of print, or seeks to escape the flatness of print, and become here having an audible dimension, as Deirdre mentioned the other day, to hear it read even, as that kind of brings out the sound qualities of accent, but also of other sounds. It's a great experience to have. But Joyce pushes these much further than just the alliterative or the assonance or the usual repertoire of the use of sound in language. He gives it a real autonomy. And in that autonomy, we get to the postmodernism of what I'd hoped you'd be able to hear, but you can look it up for yourself, Kurt Schwitter's Ur-Sonate of 1932, the radical cutting of the tie between signifier and signified, between sound and meaning. And this you have, you know, in a way you cannot possibly understand on a first reading, and which could put you off until you get hold of what Joyce is seeking to do, which you would do, you know, if you persevered, but it helps to be told and given a helping hand. In episode 11 of the novel, The Sirens, where the first few pages are absolutely incomprehensible on a first reading. But Ulysses is not a book which is meant to be read only once. It's meant to engage you in a reading which is a real reading, which is to say, a rereading. I mean, of course, most of us read all the time, and we read in different modes. You know, we read for pleasure, entertainment, the plot, the character, the excitement, with books that we may only read once or twice. But other more artistic texts, that they simply have more life in them. They last longer. You can read them for a lifetime. Generations of different people can read them because they're doing more. They're not as thin. They're not just the words on a flat piece of paper bound between a book. And Sirens is very much like this. The first few pages are at first incomprehensible, but then there's a real pleasure if you read on and then read back into seeing how actually those first few pages form a kind of musical overture to the episode. They're the episode in miniature, but of course you can only realize that on rereading it, and you see the repetition of things and see how they're woven together into this fantastic text. And here I was going to play you somebody reading that, but I can't do it because of the technology. But I'd ask you, or suggest to you that you follow the YouTube link, which is given in the next slide, which is this one. And it's a performer called Cathy Berberian reading those first pages of Sirens, which, you know, give you a sense of its musicality. In other words, Ulysses keeps moving, keeps changing. Joyce invents things from one chapter to another. He won't stay still. He's excited, he's enthusiastic, he's got a plan, but he's not going to repeat the same thing over and over again. He invents and invents and invents. It's what makes it such an extraordinary novel. It has its realist elements, beautiful realist writing. It has many, many different modernist elements of stream of consciousness writing and so on. And I'm trying to say here that just as the modernist elements grow out of the realist elements, so do the postmodern elements grow out of the modernist elements. As Joyce plays with montage and defamiliarization, he also begins to sever the relations between signifier and signified in a quite radical and musical way. So, in other words, particularly the Sirens chapter, but elsewhere, anticipates Joyce's final work, the extraordinary experiment in what Derrida called fission and fusion, the breaking of things and the bringing of things together, which is in language, which is Finnegan's Wake. And I just close today's lecture with that example of postmodernism and say a few things about it. Well, you know, or don't you ken it, or haven't I told you, every telling has a tailing, and that's the he and the she of it. Look, look, the dusk is growing, my branches lofty are taking root, and my cold share's gone ashly. Filur, filoo, what age is at? Its sown is late. 'Tis endless now sinna I or Eri Warner last saw Waterhouse's clock. They took it asunder, I heard them sigh. When will they reassemble it? Now, here, what I'm trying to get at is the ways in which, in Ulysses, but now in Finnegan's Wake, you have this fission and fusion. You have the bringing together, the overlapping of realist, modernist, and now postmodernist elements. On the one hand, you have as a kind of base of realism, you have the fact of dialogue, that even if you can't understand any particular sentence in full, you can see from the beginning that this is a dialogue between an I and a you, and that there's a telling, and maybe there's a tailing, and a he and a she of it. You can see that in some way at least it's referring to a potentially empirical movement as the dusk is growing, as the light is fading from the sky, as it's getting late, it soon is late. On the other hand, you have all those disruptions which are modernist and postmodernist. You have the playful postmodernist element of Joyce feels inclined to include the names of rivers throughout the Anna Livia Pluribel section, which this is from. So there's the Sion, there's the Senna, and various others. You have the names of trees, the ash, and so on, the branches taking root. You have the intralingual punch from the German Filur, Filur ist es, what time is it? And you have, you know, all kinds of weird things going on. The final sentence, when will they reassemble it, kind of self-performatively points to the task of the reader, which is, as I said previously, you can't read this text so that it delivers its meaning instantly. You can reread it, reassemble it, using these principles of montage and so on, where you are actively engaged in creating meaning, in finding humor, in laughing, in enjoying the work of creation, which Joyce, through his writing, seeks to share with you. And that's where we'll stop for today. I will, if anybody wants to ask any questions,